Good morning, everybody. I'm preparing to stream this adult forum to YouTube. I'll be inviting people in just a second. All right. Here we go. Adult forum to YouTube. Inviting people in. All right. I've posted a link if you are following us on YouTube. All right. I've posted a link if you are following us on YouTube. Thanks everyone for joining us. So this is our third installment of the Bible as Literature. Let me get ready to share my screen. Navigate to Hold on one second. Oh, cool. All right, Kristen, welcome. Sorry, guys, I'm having a little bit of screen share trouble. All right, let me try again. There we go. I think I got it. Okay, can people hear me? Anyone want to jump on? You can say in the Q&A. You can hear me and see my screen. That'd be great to know. Anyone want to give me reinsurance? Yay, okay. Yay, okay. Thank you guys so much. Cool. Yay, all right. Okay, so this is our third installment of the Bible as Literature. Thanks for coming back. It's third out of 4. And advance this. Okay, so I'm going to do this every single time. So to catch up those who missed the other sessions and or to remind you, yeah, that of what we've covered so far. We've talked about 4 ways of reading the Bible. We're emphasizing the 4th one, and the order that I've presented them in is the order in which I've encountered these different ways in my own exposure to Scripture. First is liturgical reading, public reading of the Bible as an act of worship, which is what we do as part of the daily office, and of course on Sundays. If you've been coming to the Episcopal Church, or if you grew up in a tradition or have exposure to a tradition that does this, that's liturgical reading. Usually involves long passages, not just quick verse quotations. Devotional reading is another form of reading the Bible that's very familiar to people. Usually it's more private, either on your own or with a small group. And its purpose is generally to increase our affection for God or to shape personal character. There's also historical critical reading of the Bible, discovering a biblical text's earliest forms and original context. So that's the dominant academic approach to reading the Bible. And lastly, what we're doing here today, learning to recognize and experience the effects of specific techniques in biblical narrative and poetry. So I say this every time, but I can't say it enough, that these are not utterly distinct, mutually exclusive ways of reading the Bible. I've found in my own life that they reinforce each other, and each one of them really does. Although I've listed it under devotional reading, I think every single one of these ways increases my affection for God. So we're doing, though, literary reading, which is, I think, a little bit less common in most Christian contexts today. All right, so we've covered some literary features of Genesis. Last week, we focused on words. So the techniques we talked about were deliberately restricted vocabulary. That means that the word bank of biblical authors is intentionally small. They'd rather repeat words like multiply or appeared multiple times rather than come up with a lot of different synonyms for things. And kind of a subset of deliberately restricted vocabulary is thematic keywords. So a word like hand or house repeats, a lot of times, 7 times for one and 15 for the other in just one chapter of the book of Genesis. So we focused very much on words last time. This week, though, we're going to focus on narrative patterns. So a lot of what I'm doing here involves paraphrase. So always with paraphrase, because what I'm trying to communicate is the shape of particular stories in biblical narrative. So it's certainly possible that, actually it's not possible, it's definite that I've left out important details, maybe worded things in a way that are not, that don't honor the deliberately restricted vocabulary or the very precise word choices of our biblical authors. But that's because today we're just trying to see the shape or the pattern of a lot of different narratives. So the 2 techniques we're talking about today are type scenes and narrative symmetry. And then next week is delayed narrative exposition, and I'll also throw in some other things that I didn't get a chance to go into in more detail. So first of all, we're going to talk about type scenes. Now, a type scene is generally a fixed set of motifs. So motifs just means common elements that are used to narrate recurring events like betrothals, that is engagements, or birth announcements. So I'm not going to do the birth announcements one, I'm just going to do betrothals. And there are other ones too. But it's basically like, if you've ever sat down and read Genesis, or even further, you might feel like, gosh, the same things happen over and over and over again, right? And this is an extreme example of this. You have a type scene. But what's important to know is that these conventions would be familiar to the audience. Okay, so an example of that is if there's a well, someone's probably going to be getting engaged, right? So that's important to know. It's not just us coming along later and interpreting this. The audience would have been familiar with these as well. So I just gave you an image to give you a sense of how confidently you can recognize a biblical type scene. If you were in an early audience for biblical literature, there's no question an image like this of exactly what's going on. If there's I'm just speaking in conventions, right? If there's a guy down on one knee, if he has a little box in his hand, someone's getting engaged, right? These are just very, you don't need to read deeper. You don't even need to see the looks on their faces, right? You know exactly what's happening in this image just from being familiar with dominant culture. Now, of course, there's lots of different ways of doing this. I'll just admit, I just read a romance novel. I don't usually read romance novels. This was a good one though. But I don't know, should I spoil it? Basically, the proposal, like many romance novels, it culminates in a proposal, but he writes notes. So we don't get a scene like this, okay? But so this is important too, that we have the conventions, but sometimes it's the variations on the conventions that make something truly interesting as literature. So we'll see examples of that here. So betrothal type scenes in biblical literature have several common elements, or we could say motifs. So one of those is that a man visits a foreign land. Okay, that's, there could be variations on this, but if a man goes to a land where he doesn't currently reside, he's probably looking for a wife. Okay, betrothal meaning engagement. A man meets a woman at a well. Okay, that happens all the time. So here we have an image of, oh man, I think this is Rebecca and a servant who's coming courting on Isaac's behalf. But you can see in this image, a woman at a well, right? The man obtains water from said well, okay? And someone hurries. This is an unusual one, but they're almost always in betrothal type scenes. Someone's in a hurry. There's some kind of rush. So these all function as little clues to the reader that some kind of engagement is going to take place. So there are several biblical examples of betrothal type scenes. Now, my focus today is on the in this series, I should say, is on the focus of Genesis. But in this case, I'm going to make an exception and follow betrothal type scenes beyond the pages of Genesis. But the first one we see is the betrothal engagement of Isaac and Rebekah, then of Jacob and Rachel, then of Moses and Zipporah in Exodus, then of Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth. And finally, we see these motifs recur in the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. So these have all the elements of betrothal type scenes, although with some variations and expansions. The point isn't just to repeat the same pattern over and over, but to attract the reader's interest by the subtle variations. So I'm going to walk through each of these just to make the point that they're based on a type scene, meaning that fixed core of elements. But what's interesting about them is the ways they adapt and recycle a lot of those elements. So we'll start with Isaac and Rebekah. So this version, I kind of like to think of it as the rough draft of a betrothal type scene, because it's not, it's a little weird. So first of all, a servant goes to a foreign land on Isaac's behalf. So this one is very unusual because the male protagonist, the one who's going to become the bridegroom, actually doesn't go. So the context for this is Abraham wants his son Isaac to marry. They're not living in their ancestral homeland, but he doesn't want Isaac to marry one of the local women. He wants him to go back to where his family is from. So when I say foreign, I should say it just means in a place where he's not living. So Abraham gets his servant and says, go back to my hometown and find a wife for my son. So that's how it gets started. And this servant meets Rebekah at a well. Okay, that's always a good sign. A woman at a well. I guess it's like the ancient bars. This is where people meet to meet their future significant others. So in this case, it's actually Rebekah who draws the water, and Rebekah is awesome because she draws. She moves very quickly when she does this. That's one element of hurry. And she not only gives a drink to Abraham's servant, but she quenches all of his thirsty camels, right? So all these camels have been on a long journey themselves. So this makes the point that Rebekah is pretty incredible, right? I don't know the answer to this, but I've seen people mathematically calculate how many gallons of water you need to quench 10 camels that have just made a long journey. Okay. And it's a lot, let me just tell you. It's almost getting comedic, I guess today it would be like if you brought an army, or if the servant came with an army of tanks and she had pumped enough gasoline for them all, like she'd be pretty great. So Rebekah hurries to draw the water, and she also hurries home to her brother Laban. So again, that's that element of hurry. That always has to, or usually anyway, occurs in a betrothal type scene. So you can see how this story conforms to the pattern of a betrothal type scene, but it also has some variations on that pattern. So what I'm going to emphasize here, I love this image because it actually has all those camels. Okay, so this is, again, Rebecca giving a drink of water to Abraham's servant. That's not actually Isaac. I need to make that point. But I have a little quote here from Robert Alter, the author of our translation and commentary that we've been using. He describes Isaac as the most passive of all the patriarchs. So that's something that carries on. So one clue or one element of it, this sort of passive characterization of Isaac, is the fact that he doesn't do his courting on his own. Okay, so you can see how you have this common pattern, but the variations on it fit some of the more individualizing characteristics of the people who participate in it. So Isaac's, not going to go wooing on his own. He has actually, it's not even his dad has a servant do it. Okay. Rebecca, on the other hand, is consistently forceful and enterprising. Now, those are Robert Alter's words. But if you know how she, secures some good things for her favorite son, Jacob, you'll know that this is very true of Rebecca. So she draws the water instead of the man, and she draws a lot of water. Okay, so she is pretty great. The feet in this case belongs to Rebecca, whereas in actually the next case we're going to see the feet belongs to the male participant in the betrothal type scene. All right, so that's how the type scene occurs. The pattern occurs in Isaac and Rebecca's story. All right, so here we have Jacob and Rachel. It's a little hard to see, but if you can see the bottom of the screen, Jacob's very strong hands are on lifting a stone, or have lifted a stone from the mouth of a well, and there is the beautiful and beloved Rachel with her sheep, her father's sheep. So here's how it goes, the type scene goes down in their case. So Isaac instructs Jacob not to marry a Canaanite and sends him to find a wife. So similar to Isaac's own story, don't marry one of the local women, go to where we're from and find someone there. So Jacob meets Rachel at a well, and she's there with her father's sheep. Jacob, so there's some complaints like, oh, it's going to take forever. How are we going to roll this stone away? Well, Jacob, strong guy, comes along and he rolls the stone away from the well and waters Rachel's sheep himself. What a guy. Then Rachel runs home to speak with her father, Laban. So you could conclude the type scene there. But what I want to emphasize here is how the biblical narrative elaborates on the type scene and makes it a little bit more exciting and romantic. So first of all, there's bigger obstacles. If you've ever read romance or watched romance, the couple always has to overcome, some obstacle. So the romance I just read, it was the female character's terrible ex-boyfriend. Okay. So here it's her father-in-law, or Jacob's father-in-law to be. So they make a deal. Laban says, yeah, like if you work for me for 7 years, you can marry my daughter. Okay. And then if you know the story, you'll know that Jacob is deceived into marrying the wrong sister. Okay. Not the one he wanted, Rachel, but Leah. So he has to work for 7 more years to get the one he really loves. So in this story, again, just to make the point, this is just another image of the same thing. We get more animals though. But again, you can see Jacob's strong arms uncovering the well for those animals. It portrays Jacob, so very different than Isaac, right? Jacob is strong and resourceful. And that's consistent with Jacob's character if you read the whole. The couple overcomes obstacles, okay? So it's not just like the same thing over and over again, right? We've added a little bit more. So it's harder for them to find each other. And I just have to highlight here that this story includes the most romantic line in the entire Bible, which is, and Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed in his eyes but a few days in his love for her. Okay, very sweet. All right. So here I just want to make the point that even though romance is the same today, right? Even though there are lots of cliches and repeating patterns, you can still do a lot within that pattern to add narrative interest and romance. This story is not very romantic. So this is Moses and Zipporah. So by contrast with Genesis, we have a lot of the same elements. So what happens here is Moses is in Egypt and he kills a man and he flees to the land of Midian and he sits down by a well. So alert readers, if you're reading that, you say, oh, he sits down by a well. That cannot be a coincidence, right? And it is not, okay? It's a sign that we are in the midst of a betrothal type scene. So the priest of Midian has 7 daughters and they come to the well to water their flock. So Moses is just sitting there by the well and lo and behold, 7 girls or women come to the well with their animals. Some shepherds come and try to drive away these women. Like, no, we want to water our flocks. But Moses gets up and saves the women, which is what we have an image of here. So we have, I love this gesture of the damsel in distress type thing, and Moses with his hand upraised, driving away the bad guys. Okay, so this is more. So Jacob, that's not, he can lift a whole stone, like that's impressive, but Moses fights off bad guys. Okay, so that's the interest here. And then the father, it doesn't say they hurried home, but when they go home, their father says, why have you hurried home? And they tell him everything that has happened. And so their father picks out one of his daughters and he's like, oh man, thank you. As a reward for your service, you can have one of my daughters. Now, it doesn't say anything about love or how he picked which one. Did he just like eeny, meeny, miny, mo? I don't know. Draw lots. I'm not sure. But one of his daughter is a reward for Moses's good service to his family and their animals at the well. So in this instance, and this is another example, we have a very strong Moses beating down all these shepherds. So in the case of Moses and Zipporah, it portrays Moses as a deliverer. Okay, so here the point really isn't to show really individualizing character traits. It's more to show how Moses acts on behalf of his people, his leadership qualities, more than his character traits. The women don't have any character traits, okay? It's just like, it's not even like one of them comes, it's like 7, and then they just pick out one at the end. But this really fits the change in the overall theme of going from Genesis to Exodus. So in Exodus, we have a story about a nation and not really a story about a family. So again, what's important is emphasizing Moses as a heroic leader, not so much emphasizing the personality traits of a patriarch and matriarch. So again, I just want to emphasize we have the pattern here, but we don't, but with variations, we can see that it serves a different purpose. Okay, that's 3 out of 5 betrothal type scenes. Ruth and Boaz is another example. So I need to emphasize here that Ruth is a much, much later biblical composition. It's more like a short historical romance rather than these, more epic scale stories of Genesis and Exodus. Ruth is only 4 chapters long, but we have lots of elements of betrothal type scenes, but some variations. So in this case, this is really important that instead of the male being the character from a foreign land who pops up at a well, it's Ruth in this case, who's a foreigner. So Ruth is from the land of Moab, historical enemies of these folks. And she's the daughter-in-law, though, of a woman from Judea. And so she, after her father-in-law dies and her own husband dies, she returns with her mother-in-law, sticks with her to try and make their way, survive in this world. So in this case, it's the woman who's a foreigner. This is, well, I'll get to that in a second. It's important though. So Boaz notices Ruth gleaning in his field. And then he tells his lads, this is Alter's translation, he tells Ruth that his lads will give her water to drink. So they don't actually meet at a well, but the principle is the same, that he is providing water for her. But it's interesting, he's not providing water through his feats of strength. He's providing water through his ownership of a whole estate, right? He has people who work for him. He has fields. So his providence is, again, not reduced to this one heroic act, but rather it's just an extension of his ability to provide generously as a household leader. And now the element of hurry is not explicit, but there is some urgency, some tone of urgency, I think, from Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, who says, okay, she says, right now, Boaz is eating, you need to go to him and, try to get some security for yourself, okay? So there's a little bit of urgency, but not hurry. So overall, the elements of the type scene are there, but they're very different. Like it's opposite. The woman is the foreigner instead of the man. And then instead of there being a specific well or a specific running from point A to point B, it's more like a tone that gets absorbed in this particular version. But the pieces are there. This is a beautiful image by Marc Chagall of Ruth and Boaz. So I'll say those motifs, that is, those common elements, aren't, instead of being in one episode that's just a few verses long, they're spread over multiple chapters in this little novella. So it's almost like, musically, it's like an improvisation on a type scene. It's longer and that kind of thing. And it's serving a brand new theme. So this is important to stress by contrast with the Isaac and Rebecca story and Jacob and Rachel. Those stories were all about leave the land where we're living. Don't marry a Canaanite. Marry someone from our ethnic group. But here, it's completely the opposite. The emphasis on is a foreign woman and she's toward the end claimed to be an ancestress of King David himself, right? So the idea here is a foreign wife can be just as integral to our nation and our family as a local girl, okay? Just, to put it kind of colloquially. So we have the same pattern, but serving but totally repurposed, right? So not for the purpose of emphasizing the importance of endogamy, marrying within your kin group, but exogamy, marrying outside of it. All right, so we're skipping all the way then to the New Testament. So we've gone from old stories to the book of Ruth, relatively more recent piece of Hebrew Bible literature, to the New Testament, in this case, the Gospel of John. So you can see from the image, right, that, I don't know, if this guy didn't have a beard and curly hair, as Jesus so often does in Renaissance painting, you could easily mistake this for a Renaissance representation of Jacob and Rachel, or someone like that. So Jesus he's going from Judea to Galilee, and on his way, he passes through the region of Samaria. So it says Jesus is tired and he sits down by Jacob's well. Okay, so again, alert readers could say, oh, this reminds me of Moses. He's exhausted from fleeing and he sits down by a well. Something engagement related will probably happen. But here, John's gospel goes so far as to say it's not just any well, it's Jacob's well, just to make that, just to hammer it home for us. So a Samaritan woman, a foreign woman, comes to the well. Well, she sees, actually Jesus is the foreigner in this case because he's not on her turf. So she sees a foreigner at the well and he asks her for water, much like the servant who woos on Isaac's behalf. And Jesus says, you should have asked me for water because I have living water. Once you drink it, you'll never be thirsty again. It comes out in the course of conversation that the woman has had 5 husbands and lives with someone who's not her husband. Jesus tells her he's the Messiah. And then this is the element of hurry. I think she leaves her water jar and goes back to her city to tell people about Jesus. So there's lots of differences here, but underlying all of it, you can see the pattern. You have a woman who runs to tell people something. You have the promise from a man of amazing, abundant water, right? And of course, you have a meeting between two people from different homelands at a well, and the topic of marriage comes up in the course of their conversation. So to be honest, I'm still pondering what the significance is. Maybe I'll get assigned to preach on this someday, and I'll crystallize my thoughts, formulate them a little bit more. But I ask often, what is the effect of crafting a New Testament story on the model of a betrothal type scene? So here's my initial thoughts. Well, first of all, there's this connection to Jacob, just saying, this isn't a totally new story. It's based on a pattern. Now, I think it's like there's a setup for a betrothal. I'm thinking about the effect on the audience. So Jesus might appear to the audience as just another man asking for service from this woman. Hey, woman, Samaritan woman, give me some water. So it's like a test. Is this someone I want to marry or not? But then there's the surprise that this isn't really a story about water. It's about Jesus promising something even better than well water, and something better than marriage, right? So I like to think of this as, I just try to come up with a contemporary analogy that if you had a story about Jesus and he was down on one knee, okay, you would think, oh my gosh, this male character is about to propose, right? But what if while he's down on one knee, instead of popping out an engagement ring, he ties the sandal of the woman in question, right? As if to say, I'm not here to marry you. I'm not here to claim you. I'm here to honor you and to have a theological conversation with you, which is what happens at this well. So it's sort of what I thought. So I'm still chewing on this, and I'd love to hear from anyone else. But often I find that people are surprised that this story isn't just invented from whole cloth, but it is very carefully crafted on the model of a betrothal type scene. All right, so we're going to leave behind type scenes, but again, recall that these are stories that are built on a fixed set of common elements that repeat, maybe in that vary as well, but you can often see the underlying pattern in each of these stories. Before we move on, I'm going to check for questions. Yeah, so Haley says she thought about reconciliation between a Samaritan and a Jew, and that's true. So it's like it's kind of like following up on Ruth, right? Not just that marriage between a foreigner and a Judean person is like a thing that can work out, right? In the story of Ruth and Boaz. But yeah, that it's not about intercultural marriage, it's about intercultural reconciliation. So yeah, that can be a very important theme. Yeah, thanks for that, Haley. Okay. So moving from type scenes to a different technique, but very similar. Oh, shoot. Oh, no, sorry, I forgot. So I just wanted to give this as an example. If you've ever seen, this may not apply to everyone in the audience, but if you've ever seen a movie with Meg Ryan in it, that's that actress there, it's a clue. It's probably a romantic comedy, right? But what makes them interesting is the variations on them. So here, this is from Harry Met Sally, where the variation there is two people fall in love, even though they've been friends forever. They don't just suddenly meet and fall in love. And then Sleepless in Seattle also follows a lot of the conventions of romantic comedy, but the couple doesn't meet actually until the very, very end. So again, just to make the point that biblical literature is like this too, that they take conventions and maybe even cliches or common elements, but they adapt them in ways that are interesting for the audience. That might add romance or add introduce a new theme. This happens sometimes, you guys. My computer is very sensitive. Okay, so yeah, so as far as literary tools, it's often the subtle variations that signify to readers some kind of distinctive character traits or major shifts in thematic emphasis. But the point here is that in biblical literature, It's much more common to recycle and remix these elements than it is to compose a story completely from scratch. All right, now at last, narrative symmetry. Okay. Narrative symmetry involves narratives that have strong points of similarity and or strong points of contrast. So like mirror images, right? Sometimes, obviously they're like the same, but they're also opposites, right? Your mirror in, my right hand when I look in a mirror is actually the left hand of the person. Actually, I can do it now. I can see myself on screen, guys. So what feels like my right hand is my mirror image's left hand. Okay, so this is the way narrative symmetry works too, that there's going to be points that are identical and then points that are the total opposite. And there'll be different ratios of that. But what should stand out in our analysis is, wow, these stories are completely different, except they have these few points of similarity. Or these stories are exactly the same, and yet they have one conspicuous difference. So I'm going to walk us through 3 examples of narrative, of symmetry between biblical stories in the book of Genesis. So one case of that is the flight of Hagar and the binding of Isaac. So artists get this, right? Readers, it's harder for us to see, but look, I'm going to walk through the details in a moment, but you can see right off the bat, we have a parent, we have a suffering and fearful child, and we have this kind of angel figure intervening on their behalf. Okay, so we'll see symmetry between those stories, symmetry between Abraham's hospitality and that of Lot. So again, 2 guys entertaining angelic visitors. And then this one, these images are both from Raphael. Actually, it's just genius. So this is the destruction by flood, way back in Genesis chapter 6 through 10, and then the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. But if you're on a screen that allows you to see some details, notice that the kind of like, in both of them, they have this kind of black crumbling wall. It's kind of like smoky that has like light, almost like a vein pattern of veins where it's crumbling or dissolving and coming apart. And so Raphael used that both in this painting of the flood on my left anyway, and then of Lot and his family fleeing from Sodom and Gomorrah. So again, artists get the symmetry. But if you're just straight up reading, it can be hard for us to notice. So those are 3 examples I'll walk through in a little bit more detail. I put a lot of this in chart form. And the reason I did that is just to point out how many common characteristics these stories have. So the flight of Hagar, in each of these cases, I think I've identified 6 things that are worth looking at more deeply, where you have either a strong point of similarity or a completely opposite point of contrast between these 2 stories. So for a little bit of just a reminder, if you haven't read it, or an introduction if you aren't familiar with these stories. So Abraham has a wife named Sarah. He has other wives too, but most of you, if you know one, you probably know Sarah, who's promised to bear a child. But in the meantime, while they're waiting for that, she arranges to have her slave, an Egyptian slave woman, Hagar, sleep with Abraham, and Hagar gives birth to a boy named Ishmael. And Hagar actually, because she's being treated so harshly by Sarah and Sarah's jealousy, she runs away while pregnant. But an angel tells her to go back. She has the child, and then Abraham kicks her out because after Isaac. So Sarah later gives birth to Isaac, and she's worried about competition between these 2 half brothers. So Abraham says, okay, Hagar, Ishmael, you're out. Here's some food. Best of luck to you. Okay. And then soon after that, this is a story we could spend a lot of time with, but here my point is just to emphasize the symmetry. Abraham is instructed to sacrifice his son Isaac. So he binds him and is about to slay him with a knife. But then a divine messenger comes in just in time. So the story of Abraham Isaac is a very common one. It comes up at the Easter Vigil, although we rarely read it. But it's a story. A lot of people know this story. There's like famous, Kierkegaard wrote about, a lot has been written about this story in isolation, but much less through, and Robert Alter's commentary points out all these details. It's much less common to read it in parallel with the story of Ishmael. So points of comparison. So in each case, who is threatened with death? In the Hagar story, it's Hagar and Abraham's son Ishmael. And in the other story, it's Sarah and Abraham's son Isaac. So in each case, you could say it's a son of Abraham. That's what they have in common, but they're the son of a different mother. That's the difference. But in both stories, basic structure that there's a son threatened with death. Where does the threat take place? Well, in both cases, it takes place in wilderness. So the wilderness of Beersheba in Ishmael's case, and a 3 days journey away on a mountaintop. But it's like the setup again is the same. I don't have a lot to say about the significance of this particular setting. I'm sure there are wonderful things to say about it, but the point is that they're like conspicuous parallels. Okay, both cases, son of Abraham is endangered in the wilderness. Which parent is present with the child? Big difference. Ishmael's mother is present, but Isaac's father is present in the other case. Who intervenes and how? Well, in the Hagar story, they're about to starve. There's not food, there's not water, and it's very sad. One of the most painful scenes in biblical literature. Hagar says, I can't watch my child starve. I can't, my eyes can't see it. And so she puts her son away from her. I think it says a stone's throw away or something, and like walks off because she just can't watch her child die. And a divine messenger intervenes and said, no, here's some provisions, you're going to be okay. But in both cases, God's messenger, and in both cases, the messenger calls the boy lad in Alter's translation. And look, this is identical, right? So in these stories that are very different, in each case, God's messenger or an angel, depending on the translation, intervenes. And so, the lad is going to be okay. Now, this is another, conspicuous difference. And in each case, a parent's hand is mentioned. If you were here last week, we talked a lot about the word hand. Here it is again. Okay. So in this case, God's messenger says, Hagar, hold your son by the hand. Okay. And in the other case, God's messenger says, Abraham, don't reach out your hand. So here, it's just one of those things that, it's just like, it's too much of a coincidence, right? That the divine messenger, references hand. That the biblical authors must want us to read these stories together. And then they conclude with promises. In Ishmael's case, the promise is that Ishmael will be made into a great nation. In Isaac's case, God will bless and multiply Abraham's seed, through which all the earth's nations will be blessed. So there's this difference that Ishmael's blessing is for him, and Isaac's blessing is for all nations. So I often, when we're trying to analyze symmetry, we can ask ourselves a lot of questions. One is a general question. Do these stories show more points of similarity or points of antithesis? Here, I guess I would say more points of similarity. Okay, hands are mentioned often, divine messenger, same basic plot, child is in danger in the wilderness, similarity. So then there are obvious points of connection, like the divine messenger intervenes in both cases. But then there are points that are more subtle, like, it's very easy to read these stories and not notice that the divine messenger uses the exact same word for the boy in question, or that there's a reference to hands. But so the point is, the symmetry is not just these macro things, but also these little details. And then the big question, what is the effect of the symmetry? So why read these stories in parallel? And what is the reader or audience supposed to walk away with by having two symmetrical stories? So again, I'd love to, if you have great insights, or just, they don't have to be great, no pressure, thoughts about this, I'd love to hear them. I have some tentative thoughts of my own. One is, this is just an observation, is that it seems hard for Abraham to kill Isaac. but very easy for him to dispose of Ishmael. Okay, so I'm not sure where to go with that, but there's more to Abraham's character than his love for Isaac. This is another way to look at it, though. Isaac. So on the one hand, Isaac looks very, very favored, right? He is the lucky one. But Isaac has a father willing to kill him, right? And Sarah's like nowhere to be seen in this story. But Ishmael has a mother who can't bear to see him suffer. All right, so it's easy to walk away from these stories and think Isaac really lucked out. But you can also look at this story and say Ishmael had something that Isaac did not. And then another way to look at this is despite all their differences. So here, if you emphasize, the divergences, different quantities of blessing that they receive, favored son versus unfavored son. Despite all their differences, a divine messenger intervenes on behalf of each lad. So here, it's like no matter what the difference is, there's that possibility of care from a divine messenger. Those are my initial thoughts. All right, so another set of symmetrical story, Abraham's hospitality and Lot's hospitality. Again, I just put this chart here so you can see, or I did put the chart there, so you can see that there are just so many elements that these stories have either strongly in common or distinctively different. One is, who are the travelers? So Abraham and Lot each entertain some divine visitors, or visitors who turn out to be divine. In Abraham's case, there's 3 divine messengers, but one of them actually hangs back with Abraham. But 2 of those same 3 go to eventually enjoy Lot's hospitality. So same guys, okay? Then when do the travelers arrive? In Abraham's case, they arrive in the heat of the day. In Lot's case, they arrive in the evening. So in both cases, though, time of day is specified. And then where do these divine messengers meet their respective hosts? Abraham is sitting by his tent flap, and Lot is sitting in the gate of Sodom. So again, in both cases, we find out that they're sitting and where they're sitting, and they're sitting at some kind of entrance. Okay. Where does the host live? This is a big difference, okay? And this is a common theme that in biblical literature, I guess more pastoral settings, so here in the terebinths of Mamre, so a grove outside of the city and the trees, are good places to be, and the city is the big bad city, okay? So Lot is living in the city of Sodom. How does the host invite the travelers to stay? Well, Abraham is just the most gracious, leisurely host you could want for. So he bows and he begs these guys, like, don't just go on your way. Come stay with me. I'll wash your feet. You can stretch out under the trees, just relax for a little bit. Lot is a little bit different. He also bows, though. He bows and he asks them to spend the night. He says, stay the night. It's evening. It's getting dark. Stay the night with me. You can leave early the next day. So this is not a leisurely invitation to hang out, right? It's a, rest up, stay safe. You can be out at the crack of dawn. Don't worry about, keeping me company, I guess. And then they say, no, we'll sleep out in the town square. And he presses that. He's like, no, you're coming home with me tonight. Okay. So there's a lot more urgency. What kind of food do the hosts serve? Well, this is just lovely in the Abraham story. He says, when he says, I'll get you some water, wash your feet, stretch out under the trees, I'll give you a morsel of bread. Okay, so that morsel of bread, though, turns into a tender calf, curds and milk, and fresh baked loaves of bread. Okay, so this is lovely. It's like, just come on in. We've got some soup on the stove, and lo and behold, I'm pulling bread out of the oven and roast chicken or something like that. Cocktails, I don't know. But it's just a lovely scene of hospitality. The sort of like, just come on, we'll have some appetizers, right? But then that turns out to be a banquet. In Lot's case, though, it says they get a feast and baked flatbread. So here we don't know, is Lot stingy with his hospitality? Like baked flatbread is different than the loaves that Sarah is actually making from choice semolina flour. And here, maybe there is a lot of food, but notice this story doesn't report the details. It just calls it a feast, but doesn't tell us, we don't get to savor that feast, whatever it is. And it's definitely prepared more hastily than Abraham's feast for the visitors. Now, in each of these stories, someone scoffs, or laughs. In Abraham's case, it's Sarah. She overhears these divine messengers predicting that she's going to have a baby, and she laughs because she's too old for that, okay? In Lot's case, it's his sons-in-law, and because Lot says, I hear from these visitors that they're going to destroy the city. We got to get out of here. And the sons-in-law say, come on, you got to be kidding, okay? But there's scoffing at the divine messengers in both of these stories. All right, so I would say that those comparanda, those points of comparison between the stories are just far too numerous and detailed to overlook. I think they're a clue that these stories need to be read side by side. So I have some initial thoughts about why we want to read these side by side. One is they emphasize that hospitality is a very high value. Abraham does just an exquisite job of it. And we get to really enjoy that. Lot is, it's less descriptive, but it's still insistent, I guess. He really wants them to stay with him. And that I think it's a positive quality in Lot. So there's a strong contrast, though, when we read these stories side by side between the leisurely hospitality of Abraham and the urgent protection from Lot. So I think that reading these stories side by side is a way to make the reader more or sort of appreciate the pace and the urgency of the Lot story. So you get the speed of these narratives accelerates. Okay, so you read the slow one, and then because you've enjoyed that slow one, you get the stronger feel for the urgency in the next one, that it's happening. Like, he's got to get these guys under his roof before the sun sets. He's got to get them fed right away because it's evening. And the protection that he offers is going to get, is important, right? Because he's protected them from the angry mobs of the city. He knows that Sodom is a dangerous place. And then they, in turn, are going to protect him and his family from the city as it is destroyed. So I think one of the effects is you get to feel the urgency in the Lot story, which if you just read it all on its own, you wouldn't appreciate that tone of it. Okay. I got a little ahead of myself talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but we're going to deal with that here. Again, the symmetry here is between the destruction by flood and the destruction of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. So here, in each case, who does God want to destroy? All right. In the flood story, it's the whole human race and all animals, and it names all the different kinds, right? The herds, the crawling things, and the birds. Okay. It doesn't mention the fish, but I guess you can't kill fish with a flood. In the Sodom and Gomorrah case, it's the inhabitants of some particular cities. Why? In the flood story, it's because every scheme of the human creature's heart is evil. All right. They're all evil all the time. Sodom and Gomorrah, the specific wording is that the outcry against the city is great. And that word for outcry is also used in biblical literature to describe the cries of the oppressed. So it's an unjust city. And it's also inhospitable, right? So Lot is hospitable, but the people around him want to assault those divine guests, and Lot wants to protect them. In the case of the flood, God saves Noah and his family because it says Noah is righteous and blameless. In the story of Lot, though, it says that the Lord saves him out of compassion. Okay, so everyone in the city is bad, but and Lot's not great, but he does have this gesture of hospitality, and it specifically says that from compassion, that is how God saves. How does God destroy? Rain falls and floods the earth in the first case. And in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, we get this verb for rain, actually, only it's the Lord rains down brimstone and fire. Okay, so it is interesting. Different elements, water versus fire, but the verb for rain stays the same. What happens to the male survivor afterward? This is one of those parallels that I never picked up on until reading Alter's commentary. In the case of Noah, he plants a vineyard, drinks wine, and one of his sons sees him. Oh no, typo. He's an apostrophe when I shouldn't have. One of his sons sees him naked while he's drunk, passed out drunk. His son sees him naked. Something eerily similar happens in this story, only Lot's daughters get him drunk and reproduce with him. So in both cases, there's drunkenness as well as inappropriate nakedness, to say the least, between father and child. And then we have similar wording. So in each case, how do they describe the task of survival? God instructs Noah to keep seed alive over all the earth. And Lot's daughters have their plan to reproduce with their father by saying we need to keep alive seed from our father. So the expression is the same. So a lot of these parallels I'm still pondering, right? But overall, the effects of reading the stories side by side, and again, it's like they have to be read side by side. There's so many comparable elements. So I think overall, what we notice about Sodom and Gomorrah, as the narrative of Genesis goes along, is that the scale of destruction contracts. And we might not appreciate that. It goes from all humans and animals to for just generic evil to injustice in one particular city. Okay, so over in the general arc, God's destructive acts are getting smaller. Also, we learn that God has more than one way of destroying, by water in one case and fire in the other. But we also see something else, that God has more than one way of saving. God saves Noah and his family for Noah's righteousness and blamelessness. And I've left this part out, but Abraham kind of tries to talk God down. Like, if there's some righteous people living in the city, will you save it? And he's like, okay, if there's like 10 righteous people. But there aren't that many righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, apparently. But God can save purely from compassion, and especially in response to small gestures or important gestures of this virtue of hospitality. All right, there's also a bonus here of chiasmus. If you remember from our first meeting, chiasmus is this technique of arranging things so that two words or narrative patterns repeat. First, well, you could have one word and then the next, and then they repeat in reverse order. So we would characterize that as word A, word B, and then word B repeats in some similar form or turn, and then word A repeats like that. Okay, so we actually have that in these two stories. We have the destruction of the world by flood. Then we have a story of Abraham's hospitality. Then we have another story of hospitality, and then another story of destruction. Okay, so I just want to point, that's just a bonus, that the layout of biblical narratives is often in that way, that you get parallels nested within parallels. All right, so as usual, I'm going to conclude with some questions to ponder. This is phrased a little differently from last time, but when we put more emphasis on the plot of individual stories, so this is very common. I've heard I remember going to a church summer camp where we heard a wonderful story about Hagar fleeing and being protected. And I've heard sermons and things on the story of Abraham and Isaac. But when we put more emphasis on the plot of individual stories than we do on the patterns that those stories follow, what do we miss? The woman at the well is another one. I've heard beautiful, reenactments and stories of women at the well, but I've never heard people talk about how it conforms to these patterns. And then this is the same from the last two times. What does attention to the Bible's literary features reveal to us about God? So my concluding thoughts here, based on what we walked through today. One is, the more things stay the same, the more things change. So you may have heard the reverse, right? The more things change, the more things stay the same. But in the case of biblical literature, the opposite happens, right? That what stays the same are the narrative patterns, the conventions, the stylistic touches. But what radically changes are the content. So we have a story about Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel that is all about marriage within your kin group. But then we get Rachel and Boaz, where we still have a well, we have a foreigner and a meeting in a foreign land, I should say. But it's about exogamy, like the opposite theme. So what stays consistent in biblical literature is not the message or the theme or the content, I guess we could say, but the but the patterns, okay, get recycled and remixed. So a lot of things stay the same, but we shouldn't be tricked by that, deceived into thinking that themes or messages don't change. And then the other takeaway, I think, is that there's always more than one side. There's always another side to the story. Okay, so I've given some examples of stories that have another side. That it would be easy to read the Isaac story in isolation and say, look, Isaac is chosen to bless all nations and spared by his father. But the other side of the story has a lot of pain, right, for Ishmael that we shouldn't forget or avoid, but it also has a lot of promise that divine intervention, and in the case of Lot's case, salvation from destruction happens in other ways and not just the ways that we've been trained and taught to favor. So I will wrap it up here, but if anyone has any questions they've posted, yeah, we're right at 11 o'clock or 11:01. You're welcome to post questions in the chat or just sign off. And I will see you next week. I wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving. But I will see you next week for our concluding segment on the Bible as literature. Gotta thank you. You are so welcome. Thank you for being here. Yay, thanks. Thanks for the good wishes. Have a great visit with Bailey, Kristen. All right, well, I'm going to wrap us up, and it was great to be with you all.